Well, thank you for a really kind introduction. It's really wonderful to be here, but also a little intimidating because many of you I know socially almost more than I know professionally, and it's like, oh, right, okay, this is the other role, and I can do this one too. I come from a mixed marriage, a psychologist married to a demographer sociologist. And so that and the joint degree program, which I'm teaching in, has taught me that certain kinds of vocabulary that I take for granted or methods that I take for granted are not always taken for granted by other people. So I'll try to make a case for the kinds of methods that we're using here, but the commonality, I think, in what I study and my lab studies and what many of you guys do is to look at the effects of social structure on how people cope and deal with each other. So that's really the bottom line here. And that's why the title has divided by status and competition. So I'm a psychologist, and I study how people make sense of other people, and increasingly nowadays people have need of the following t-shirt. Many students in particular tell me that, if they're ethnically ambiguous, other people say, well, where are you from? I mean, really, where are you from? The person says Dallas. And they said, no, before that. And, oh, your English is really good. It's like, Anyway, so what I want to talk about is the fact that given that our demographics are getting more complex and interesting all the time, is it a matter that there are just, too many to make sense of systematically? Whoa. Did I do that? Too many to make sense of, or are there systematic dimensions that underlie how different groups are seen in society? And I'll be making the argument that there's a pretty simple way to look at this, and that it actually turns out to be quite useful and powerful across a range of domains. So what I'm going to be doing is talking about how social cognition, that is people making sense of other people, varies along predictable dimensions. And as a result of that, so does the extent to which people humanize or dehumanize each other. And that also in-group humanizing, that is priority given to your own group or the societal reference group, also has processes that are related to this. So let me give a brief background on the stereotype content model, which is the framework that we use for doing all of this. And Amy Cuddy, who's a Princeton PhD, and Peter Glick, who teaches at Lawrence University, are my collaborators on this. So we have, you might think of it as a meta-theoretical context, a sort of social evolutionary idea, which is, what do you need to know about the stranger coming toward you on the street or anywhere else, any other environment? Or what do you need to know about a new group who is emigrating to your country? First of all, you need to know what their intentions are. And this is the critical concept for everything else that follows. You need to know whether they intend good or ill toward you and your kind of people. If they're intending well toward you, then people assume there's 2 seats up here for anybody who's not afraid to be close to me. If they intend well toward you, if they have good intentions toward you and your kind, then people infer that the other is intrinsically warm and trustworthy and sincere, just on the basis of inferring their intentions. If not, then they're not to be trusted, and they're not warm. So this is about intentions. What are their intentions toward us? Once you know their intentions, you have to know whether they can act on those intentions, because they're not so significant if they can't act on them. And that's the second dimension. Are they able or unable? Are they competent, capable, and so on? So, for example, if you have an angry bunny rabbit outside of Monty Python, that doesn't actually matter very much. For those of you who haven't watched Monty Python lately, there's a good episode about a killer rabbit. So these are our 2 dimensions, and they're dimensions that I came up with at one point, actually for a 1998 publication, when I was trying to think about different stereotype content, hence the name of the model. And they're very simple, and as a social psychologist, I tend to think in 2x2 designs. But they turn out to be a hammer that you can hit a lot of different things with. So it's a two-dimensional space. Let me walk you through it. So some groups are seen as being low on warmth and also low on competence. And it turns out all over the world that poor people fall into this category, and also people without an address. In Europe, gypsies fall into this category too. So for some reason, people without an address are seen as not trustworthy and also as not competent. And people report that they, more than any other groups, elicit disgust. So disgust is a bad emotion to be the target of, because disgust can be directed toward objects as well as people. You know, you can be disgusted at a pile of garbage or at a contaminated person. So that's pretty extreme. We think of these as kind of the lowest of the low in terms of the images that they have. Directly, okay, come on. Directly opposite to that are the in-group, that is the societal in-group, its allies and societal reference groups, that people report feeling pride and admiration for. In most countries, citizens of that country go in that part of the space, and also middle-class people. So these are like the prototypic people of whatever country it is. So this much, the in-group, out-group, big contrast, the old intergroup relations literature would have gotten you there. And so that's not so much unique to us, although the emotions part is. But what's interesting about this are the ambivalent parts of the space. So for example, groups that are seen as highly warm but not very competent include older people and people with physical or mental disabilities. They're well-intentioned, but they can't do much. And so therefore they're not very consequential to other people, and they elicit and sympathy. So think about pity for a second. It's an ambivalent emotion. It says, I feel sorry for you. It makes me feel good to feel sorry for you, but as long as you're below me. If you start getting too uppity, I'm not going to feel sorry for you anymore. Right? So it's a kind of a paternalistic emotion. It seems to require 3 clicks. I have to remember that. Okay, so then opposite to that is the interesting set of people who are high competence but low warmth. Rich people all over the world are seen this way. Professionals, Ivy League people. This means all of us. And outsider entrepreneurs end up here in every society. And they elicit envy, which is, again, a mixed emotion. It says, you have something I kind of like and admire, but I'd like to have it instead of you. So that's a kind of volatile situation to be in, and it's dangerous. So we did a representative sample survey at one point. These are the samples' combined estimates of competence and warmth. What you can see is then the lower left, you have, in the United States, poor people, people on welfare. Homeless people are 3 standard deviations out from the center of the space. So we took them out of the cluster analysis because they distorted it. But it means, literally, they're from a different population, right? And we'll come back to this. Some of these groups are idiosyncratic to social psychology and the history of what groups have been studied. Turkish people are in there for that reason. But when we ask about Muslims and Arabs, they always end up right here. A little more competent than these groups, but definitely not us. Up here you see the groups that I predicted, and down here rich people and Asians and Jews. And Brits are all seen as competent but not so warm. And then up here you see Americans, Christians, middle-class people. Those are sort of prototypes for the society. Housewives we can talk about later if you want to. The reason we have black professionals versus poor blacks is that in the first few pilot studies we did, black people were right here. And I said, that can't be right. I mean, but if I'm So we split them by social class, and we figured if we were wrong, they'd still end up here, but they didn't. So social class split black people. So the same was true for gay men. Gay men were initially in the middle, and I was thinking, given the amount of homophobia in the world, that can't be right. So we split the gay men up into subtypes that people reported to us and recognized, and they spread out across the space in the same way. The emotions that are listed there are the emotions that scored the highest for this corner of the space in each case, more than for the other three corners. So because of certain influences, I decided to study immigration. So we put some anchor groups in: poor people, older people, Americans, rich people. But within that space, what you can see is that and homeless people, look at them again, they're way off the chart. But what you see is that the low part of the space where I put immigrants before, it's really immigrants of color and undocumented ones. So undocumented ones are here: Mexicans, Latinos, Africans, South Americans, farm workers. They're all down here in the low part of the space. These circles, did I say they're cluster analyses? They're cluster analyses. Okay. Up here in the envy part of the space with the rich people are Asians, Japanese, Koreans, Chinese, and people in the tech industry. Well, it's recognizable. You're laughing because you recognize the stereotypes, right? Okay. And up there, the Irish and Italians are in the sort of stereotypes. One thing that interests me here is that Asian Indians are up closer to Americans than some of the other Asians are. That fits some other data, I think. European immigrants are here, so they're, quote, just like us. I also think it's entertaining that the Canadians are better than we are. Yeah, so, but anyway, so, you know, this is why I say we've been given a hammer and we're hitting a lot of things with it, and they make sense. In a way, the validity of it is, do you look at it and recognize it? Okay, but there's more to it than that.
Yeah, can you tell us whose opinions these are?
So in the first study, it's a representative telephone sample survey. Adults of all ages, and you get no demographic differences. So men and women say the same. Americans, they were the first study. People, so the question that we ask is, at first, but then you'll see we evolve. The question that we ask is, how are these groups viewed in society? Do most people view them as warm, trustworthy, and so on, capable, trustworthy, and so on? There's a consensus. People know, even if they're a member of that group, how their group is viewed, and so you don't get big individual differences in, you know, how the society is viewed. We've never found anything that changes it much. So let me just be honest about this, because I'm not a demographer and I'm not a social scientist, broadly speaking. Most of the samples I'm going to show you are not representative samples, because it turns out not to matter. And it's way more convenient to just run any old people from a society, usually students, and say, how are these groups viewed in your society? In the cases where we do compare it to representative sample surveys in that society, it's the same. And, you know, so it's just cheaper to get, yes?
Why do you ask about the respondents' opinions about the general feelings and not ask the respondent about their own feelings?
Okay, the reason that we ask about the respondents' opinions of how society views them was, at first, we thought that people wouldn't admit to stereotypes, because people are very, especially Americans, are very guarded about that. You'll see as we move on in the research that we've done more recently, we have evidence that these societal images rub off on individual responses in neuroimaging data that I'd like to be able to show you, and some other data like that. So even though it might not seem ideal to ask about images of society, if you think about it, it's kind of what we're doing is we're getting a societal map. We're getting a cultural map of how the groups are viewed as relating to each other. It's sort of like lay people's theory of how society operates. That's right, Betsy.
So how do you deal with the fact that which one of these is the master status? So if I'm a Japanese elderly person, which one of those would I be in?
It depends on the context. So the intergroup relations literature would say it totally depends on context. We could be relating as women or as professors or younger and older. There are all kinds of things that you could do. Depends on the particular context. Whoops. Okay, so the overall causal model that I'm not going to walk all the way through this time because I have some other data I prefer to show you, is that the social structure, perceptions of competence and competition, and perceptions of status, respectively predict perceived warmth, trustworthiness, and perceived competence. And I can tell you that all around the world, the correlation between competition and warmth is extraordinarily high. It's like 0.7. The correlation between perceived status, where you measure it, do they have prestigious jobs, are they economically successful, and then the trait of competence or capability is 0.8. It's unbelievable. I mean, I thought surely there'll be some sour grapes. People will say some of these high-status people got there because they had advantages, or they were intermarried, or they had connections. They aren't actually that smart. People don't say it. I mean, the belief in meritocracy, it's not just an American thing. It turns out it's everywhere we go, it's the same. So we can talk about why that is. But so these stereotypes then combine to produce these emotions. We didn't pick these randomly. I don't have time to go into the theories, but there are other theories in psychology that would have predicted these particular emotions for people who are, for example, in a bad way and it's not their fault. And these in turn predict so one takeaway message from all this is discrimination, for example, is not one size fits all. It's going to differ depending on the group. They'll be disrespected or disliked or some combination of that, and that will have different implications for how they are treated in an organization or in a society. Okay. So we've now have data, much of it convenience samples. I would say most of it convenience samples, but from all over the place. So thanks to the internet, people get in touch with us and we say, sure, here's the template, here's how you do it, translate it. The protocol is that we always ask people to first do a preliminary sample where they ask open-endedly, what groups are there in your society, which groups are really high status, which groups are low status, what groups are you a member of, and then we tell them to look, and we work with them for groups that are mentioned by at least 15 to 20% of the sample, because we figure those are groups that people will recognize and agree are groups in that society. And then a separate group of people from the same general population answer the warmth and competence questions and the other ones. So this is how we can do it. And they do it obviously in their own language if it's not English. So it turns out to work in all kinds of domains. I met Federica Durante when she gave a paper at an international meeting where she had content analyzed fascist magazines for how they discussed different social groups. And she'd done some analyses of this, and she generated articles which blew me away. So it's not like a modern politically correct cosmopolitan kind of belief. At least the dimensions are not. So what you see with the fascists is you get, the reference groups for them were the Italians and the Aryans, right? The groups that were threatening to them were Jewish people and English people. And the groups they were disgusted by were black people and mixed race people, right? And they didn't pity anybody. Fascism. We do find some cultural differences. So you could think of the fascist example as one cultural difference. What you see in East Asian countries, we have 3 or 4 samples from East Asian countries. What you see is that the high part of the space is missing. Instead, they've migrated to sort of a more neutral, modest, humble, instead of saying like Americans do, we're the greatest, we're the best, they just say, well, we're okay. Of course, some other people are worse. But, and that fits a lot of the cultural psychology literature about norms about a mature person is not overly self-promoting, right? They mentioned children as one of the groups. So, we have to go with the groups that they tell us. And again, look at homeless people, So you see similar things in other East Asian countries too. So it's not just a sort of one-shot thing. Now, given that we began to get a bunch of data from a bunch of places, we wanted a way of summarizing it in a principled way. And it occurred to us that in the American case and a few others, you get clusters in all four corners of the space, which means that warmth and competence are orthogonal to each other, right? But they're not always orthogonal to each other. I mean, this is why they're interesting and why they make sense, is because they are, in fact, in many cases orthogonal. Maybe the battery's not good. Sometimes you see this. So the Swiss French, have pretty much of a vector, right? And so do a few other, and you do see the recognizable in-group and societal reference groups there. And rich people and Jews and German Swiss, they're sort of down here, but not anywhere near like they were down here before. And the same with disabled people. And in many European countries, the people on welfare and poor people are than they are in the United States. But the groups that are beyond the pale here are asylum seekers, gypsies, and drug addicts. Okay? So what we see in countries that have a big social safety net is frequently there are clusters on the vector that are up here, and the ones that are not eligible for the social safety net are down here off by themselves. So you end up with this space that's more of a vector. So this got us thinking, and teaching in the JDP Inequality seminar got me thinking some more about inequality. And we decided to see whether this would vary as a function of inequality in the society as a whole. So we took the Gini for the samples that we had, and we looked at the correlation between income inequality in the country and the extent to which warmth and competence were correlated. So the idea is the more income inequality you have, the more explaining you have to do. Because otherwise you're going to have some very angry people on your hands and people who aren't going to stay with the program. And so the idea was that in places that have a high degree of income inequality, then you need to have more, well, they're poor and miserable, or they're poor and disabled, but it's not their fault, so they're really good people, it's just that they're badly off, or the rich people sold their souls to get that way, and so, it's a more nuanced kind of description. And so what you see is the correlation is negative, so across these different samples. And we have some other correlations tell a story about the belief in more equal countries that, for example, being competitive is not the most competent thing to be, and unnecessary and not warm and nice and so on. So that's my most macro level variable. Take a good look at it, it's gone. Okay, so I use a term like universal with some caution because, do we dare? But, we've seen it over different places and here the test is, do warmth and competence spread the groups out in some meaningful way that correlates with other variables like the emotions and structural variables and some of the behaviors. We've seen it over time. We've seen it in American students at Princeton. The first stereotyping study in this country was done in 1933 at Princeton and repeated once every 20 years or so since then. And so we were able to recode those open-ended data with blind coders into warmth and competence. And there's some interesting stories to tell about that. But the bottom line is the groups don't move that much, except that people don't mention the negative dimension anymore. They don't reverse it, but they just don't mention it. They say, oh, that group is really nice. But are they smart? Well, and listeners get that. So when you measure the innuendo and you measure whether listeners understand that the the dimension is negative, in fact, they get it. And then we see it over subtypes. So I've referred to looking at subtypes of immigrants, subtypes of gay guys. Thomas Eckes early on did one of subtypes of men and women. And then we asked African American students to tell us about different subtypes of African Americans, and that also has subtypes within black people, as far as black people themselves are concerned. So the critical thing I said was intentionality. Well, if the critical thing is intentionality, who else has intentions? So who's like us? Our dogs and cats are just like us, especially my cats, you know. Who are the predators, who are competent but not on our side, right? Who are pathetic? And notice that people eat these. You eat the pathetic ones, right? And then who are the sort of slimy, you know, kind of creepy ones? They're down here. Chickens. Well, I don't know why chickens are there. Fish, yeah. And where they are in the space predicts the degree to which people want to protect them and save them and other ecologically correct things. Collective human beings are also have intentions. So the all-American brands are Campbell's and Johnson & Johnson and Hershey's and Coke. People feel like at home with those, you know. And when they mess up, people forgive them. On the other hand, some brands that are not seen as so, you know, well-intended or competent, they're disgusting. And here are the envied brands, the luxury ones, and then the government-subsidized ones, right?
How did you generate these brands? Because you said in the other cases you asked.
Yeah, in this case,
who are the groups? So how did you generate?
in this case, it was more ad hoc. So this guy's a marketing executive, and he wanted to do this, and I said, well, not without me, you're not doing it, because I want to, you know, have some impact on how you do it, make sure I agree with how you're doing it. So he was generating brands from his experience, yes.
And what are the axes here? Are these different?
So these are a little bit different because if you say, is this company nice, people kind of don't know what to do with that. So it was, what are their intentions? So their intentions are good for their customers, good for America, so on, and ability is basically competence. That one wasn't so hard to do. But the idea that corporations are seen as intentional agents has inspired us to work on a book together, which I'm thinking of how to save the corporations from themselves, but he tells me I can't call it that. So we'll see. It might be the human brand, maybe. Okay, so what I want to do now is take you on a little tour of each corner of the space, because the idea behind this is that if people spontaneously categorize other people as above them and below them in a hierarchy and more competent, less competent, and on their side or not on their side, we ought to have characteristic ways of responding to people who fit into these corners of the space, because they keep coming up over and over again, these types. And again, you could make a sort of quasi-evolutionary argument about it, but let's look at it cell by cell here. So one of the first things we did was compare the high status and low status, high competence, low competence halves of the space, partly because that correlation was so high. The status competence correlation being 0.8 just seemed worth pursuing a bit. Oh, that's the Russell Sage book. So, which focused on status issues from a psychology point of view. So this is Princeton, and Rachel Farnsworth, the person in the middle there, was doing a senior thesis, or looking for a senior thesis topic, and she said, and I was teaching a course on interpersonal perception, and I was using the trolley problem, and she said, what if you put different people on the train track and different people on the overpass? And Lasana, who was my teaching assistant, we looked at each other and went, wow, yes. I will. But the point is that this undergraduate had the inspiration. So the hypothesis that we were pursuing is that people are valued according to their status, especially us versus them. The trolley dilemma works like this. There's an out-of-control streetcar going along the track. If it gets all the way to the end of the track, it's going to kill those 5 people who are on the track. But Joe is standing here next to another bystander who, it happens, is big enough that if he pushes him off the overpass, he will stop the speeding trolley car, but he'll be dead. So it's a question of 1 versus 5, right? And you know, experimental philosophers at Princeton and elsewhere have used this as a way of looking to see how people make moral decisions. There's such a big literature on this that the experimental philosophers call it trolleyology. And the way the majority of people say this is not okay. You really can't sacrifice 1 person by pushing him over and saving 5 people. But Rachel's thought was, well, maybe it would depend on who's being sacrificed and who's being saved. So we're using this as a vehicle for judge value of people. We got acceptability ratings, and we were also interested in the extent to which people were making these judgments in a kind of automatic it's fine sort of way, or it's not fine, or were they kind of grappling with it before they were saying, yeah, it's probably okay. And so some of the neuroimaging networks that are activated when people are thinking hard about a social decision are pretty well known by now, and so we decided to use that as a way to make an inference about whether they're thinking hard or not. So the acceptability ratings. The baseline, as I mentioned, is 80 to 90% say it's not okay if you don't specify who's on the track and who's on the overpass. There's a main effect for who's being sacrificed, so it's 69% say it's okay to sacrifice low competence groups. It flips, and it gets worse. 77% say it's okay to save high competence.
What specific groups did you use?
So the groups, oh, thank you for asking that. The groups that we used, we've developed a picture stimulus set that are instantly recognizable. That's a rich guy. That's a homeless guy, right? And we've pre-tested the heck out of them because in the scanner you don't have much time. You need people to look at it and say, oh, this is an old guy or a disabled person. So we have these pictures, and what we did was pick 2 groups from each corner of the space. So we have rich people and business people for the envy groups, you know, and homeless people and drug addicts for the low part of the space, and so on. So people are, and then the 5 people on the track are always the same kind of group because it just got too complicated if we mixed them. Okay.
And the pictures were a similar level of
resolution?
well, like, was it a headshot or a...
No. So in this early work that Lasana and I did, they were more sort of rich stimuli, but also more noisy, right? So sometimes people's status was betrayed by what was around them.
Yeah.
When Mina did her work, which I'll describe in a minute, she stripped the background away. She made it the same size. She made the pictures of the same, you know, facial orientation. So she controlled the heck out of it just to make sure, and it still works. So here's the real kicker, is the interaction between sacrificed and saved. It's okay to sacrifice 1 poor person to save 5 in-group people. 84% of the time. That's truly flipping the result completely. And it differs, so because there are 2 in each corner, it's a 1 to 15 contrast, and it differs from all the other ones. So these are Princeton students, you know, we want to know how callous they are. Are they really just sort of saying fine, or are they agonizing about it? So for the brain scans, they're doing this in the scanner, this particular study. And so for the brain scans, we could zero in on that particular contrast of this particular comparison where there's 1 poor person on the overpass and 5 in-group members on the track. And we could focus in on a priori on what is known to be when people are grappling with a difficult social decision. Now, what I want you to pay attention to in particular is this, my favorite area of the brain. This is the medial prefrontal cortex. It's right here, looked at front on, or looked at sideways. It's like that. It's a big swath of cortex, but this particular area that's right here, as opposed to further down or further up, is really, really, really reliably by meta-analysis activated when people think about other people. It's kind of cool. You know, and it comes online just when you try to figure out somebody's mind or predict what they're going to do or think about their intentions. There's that word again, intentions. It's also part of a general system of social decision making, which includes the precuneus and the posterior cingulate and so on. But we're going to come back to this one again. So this is the one I want you to remember because this comes up again and again in our research. So it's correlated with activation in the MPFC. And this whole network where they're trying to think about what to do and what's okay and what's not okay and the situations of the people on the track and on the overpass. So what we see from that study is that there's a contrast between high status and low status people and who's okay to sacrifice and save, particularly when you do it with that interaction. Okay, let's focus in. I promised I'd do a quick tour of each quadrant. So remember, the homeless people are always 3 standard deviations out from the center of the space. So Lasana Harris and I focused in on homeless people as a sort of case study. And it occurred to us that if this area of the MPFC reliably activates when you're thinking about other people, it might not activate as much when you're thinking about homeless people because people just don't want to think about what's going on in their lives. It's just too horrible. Think about what people do when they see a panhandler on the street. They avoid eye contact, they make a detour, they're disgusted, they don't want to touch the person, right? So this seemed to us to be a possibility for a form of what we came to think of as dehumanization. So these disgusting groups might not trigger the usual social cognitive response. And that's in fact the case. These are effect sizes for the 4 parts of the space. In this particular sample, this is not significantly above baseline, although you can see it's not 0. This is where it ought to be, and nothing's happening. So the dog's not barking. And so when we got this MPFC result, and we aren't the only people who've gotten it, other people have gotten it for disgusting outgroups since then, we started to ask people some questionnaire items in a different sample. And so we said, you know, how easy is it to get inside this person's head? You attribute a mind to him, not in those words. And you see that it's just way lower for this part of the space than for everybody else. How likely are you to interact with these people? Way less than anybody else. Do you know anybody like this? No, I don't. And then a bunch of items that factor analyze to competent, autonomous, and warm and familiar. So the questionnaire items are paralleling the brain activation patterns. At this early stage of our neuroimaging work, I have to admit that we weren't doing the same study, so I can't report correlations to you, but we were getting parallel findings, and other people have gotten the brain findings too, and Lasana has replicated it since then. Okay, so this is just a tour. It's a smorgasbord, okay? So let's look at another part of the space and how we thought about that. So Mina's analysis was to think about these envied out groups as groups that are competent and they control resources, and so we need them. And our model predicts that people associate with groups that are competent but cold, like they have stores that we have to shop at, for example, or you might have to work with them. But when the chips are down, people attack and fight them. So many groups that are the objects of genocide fall into the competent but cold part of the space over history. So this resentment is, you know, and so the question she had was, would they elicit schadenfreude, that is malicious glee, right? So here's this guy, you know, he's got his yacht, he's feeling pretty good about himself. But he's standing really, really close to the edge, isn't he? You know, I mean, how would you feel if he stepped backward and fell into the water? That would kind of be okay, you know, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to kill him, but you wouldn't mind if he got a little wet, right? Might bring him down to size. If on the other hand I said, well, he's just bought a new Rolls Royce to drive to his yacht, Yeah, you got it. So, we feel, admittedly, we hate to say it, but a little good about their bad events, and a little bad about their good events. And so people do report that. So we did pictures from all 4 parts of the space, the cleaned up ones that I was telling you about. And people do report feeling least good about their positive events. I mean, these are everyday things like had a good sandwich, And then the negative events were things like sat in gum on a park bench or stepped in dog poo. And people feel least bad about that for the rich people. But they're just reports, and maybe people are not being totally honest. So Mina decided to try to package that reaction that you had, a little smile about, oh, these people, are sort of happy to see him fall in the water. So if you use EMG electrodes, you can catch the intent to smile, the thought of a smile. Not even visible to the naked eye, right? Just the muscles are twitching like, ha, right? And so and the zygomaticus major is well established as a smile muscle. So she did this, and she showed people all these combinations of photographs and everyday good and bad events. And what you find is if you take the difference between positive and negative events, for 3 out of the 4 groups, marginally significantly in one case, good events make you smile more than bad events do, but not for the envy group. They actually smile significantly more for their bad events when they get their comeuppance. And Mina has some other behavioral data too that involve self-reports of helping and harming. And people who feel more schadenfreude are more likely to report having harmed the group that they envy, like insulting them or throwing food at them or at a sports event. Okay, let's keep moving because I want to respect your time and also have time for questions. So let's move to the high warmth part of the space, but low competence. So remember I mentioned these are the people who are pitied. And remember I mentioned that, pity is a sort of contingent response. You get pitied as long as you're cooperative. But as soon as you start to rebel against your pitiful status, then you forfeit the pity. And there are several groups that are in this part of the space. And the theme that it seems to us, the theme that they have in common is that the stereotypes about them are prescriptive. That is, we tell those people what to do and how to be. And as long as they cooperate, they get pitied. But as soon as they rebel against this inferior status and paternalized status, they don't merit pity anymore. And there's some social psych theory that I could explain, but I don't want to go into it. I'd rather show you data. One of the groups that we looked at were people with disabilities. They're high warmth, so they're on our side, but they're low competence, so they're below us. And my argument is that we pity them if and only if they adhere to our prescriptions for them. So that means that a disabled person is penalized if it's their fault that they're disabled. They went down the ski slope despite the fact that they were told not to do it, right? They jumped off the roof because they were being stupid, right? That kind of thing. Or if they don't cooperate in their rehab. So this is another senior thesis student actually, Jen Wu. She constructed 32 different vignettes, which were all of about the same level of injury and harm or a disability as people rated them. And she manipulated whether they were at fault for the cause of their disability because they were reckless, and if they were at fault for sustaining the disability because they neglected their treatment. This is a fully crossed design. Each of these independently penalizes the ratings of the person on positivity, right? So if you're a disabled person, you get penalized for being at fault in either one of these ways. And what Jill and Dan came on board to do with her was to look at the effects of this on this MPFC area that's so crucial. So very fresh data. They were just delivered on Friday, so we're still kind of thinking about them and interpreting them. But and we have some correlation analyses to do, but fault for the cause activates MPFC over all the other situations. So when the person was stupid enough to go down this black diamond ski slope when they're a beginner skier, you think, what was he thinking? Why did he do that? Right? So what's interesting about this to me is that you might think that being a disabled person and in the pity cell, if it's your fault, then you should drop down to the disgust cell, and therefore people wouldn't think about you anymore. But that's not, they're not there yet. People are still saying, how could he do that? Would I do that? Would I be that dumb? So they're mulling it over more than in all the other cases. This is a reverse inference from the brain data, but we have some questionnaire data that we can correlate with it. Like I said, this is very fresh data, but it's that same MPFC area. And this is not unique to us. As I mentioned, there are meta-analyses that show that this is reliably involved in social cognition. Okay, so, but it seems to us that if there's a penalty for rebelling against your status, then that's a prescriptive stereotype. Here's another one. Mike North and I have been working on a theory about ageism, which prescribes that older people, that's the guys in white at the front of the line, need to step aside and yield resources to the younger generations. So it's kind of a resource tension model of young-old ageism. And, you know, consumption in the line, here are the young people, the middle-aged people, and those old people, they're using everything up. They're using up the Social Security, you know, and the young people resent that. So that's another prescription. Step aside and don't use everything up when you're at the front of the line. And then there's an identity dimension also. Act your own age, don't listen to our music, don't wear our clothes. Don't go to see our movies, you know. So basically, what Mike has done is set up videotapes where people are either adhering to the prescriptions or violating them. And people of young, middle age, and older, they're saying the same script. And what you find is that to the extent that the person is not cooperating, they take a hit. And they only take a hit if they're old. So the same stingy behavior by a middle-aged person or a young person with it. And we see this in particular for younger raters, and then we also have this scale of ageism, and people who score high on it particularly show this kind of resentment. So this is my kind of paranoid view of ageism here. Luckily, Mike is going to take this with him when he graduates, and that's good. Okay, I'm going to skip over the gender data. Well, okay, I won't. So, I don't have time to go into it right now, but in most samples, traditional women are in the top left corner of the space. In the random sample survey, they weren't. We could talk about that. But in almost every other case, traditional women are nice but stupid.
You will have to find traditional women.
Traditional. But the rebellious ones, the feminists, the lesbians, the professionals, are competent but cold. Okay?
Yes.
So we have data on this. We are. So this is inherently a prescriptive kind of stereotyping, which is, you know, if you want to be liked, then you have to be nice, but you can't be too smart, and there are trade-offs that we call benevolent sexism. But hostile sexism is devoted to the women in the lower corner who are threatening for some reason, because hostile sexism views gender relations as a combat. And that's what this particular thing gets at. So for heterosexual men, especially hostile sexist, gender roles are particularly prescriptive. And in this particular case, we wanted to look at sexualized women, that is women in bikinis, for example, who are seen to have only bodies and not minds. One of the predictions we made is that these particular guys, the hostile sexists, would recognize the bodies of sexualized women, but not their faces. That is, they're not individuating them. They don't care about their minds. They just care about the body. And they might deactivate the MPFC, the social cognition network, because that's the last thing they care about right then, right? But it would be correlated with hostile sexism. And so I'm not saying this about all the men in the room. I just want you to understand that. I'm not trying to be divisive.
Only those of you who are hostile sexist.
Surely nobody here. Okay, so what Mina did was get pictures of fully clothed men and women in bikinis. She controlled for orientation, the size, and everything like that. You see, first of all, in the body recognition data, it's two main effects. People are recognizing the women's bodies more than the men's, and scantily clad people more than fully clothed people.
What is body recognition?
Okay, sorry, thank you. So when they saw the original stimuli in the scanner, they saw this whole thing. When we did the recognition test, because we were thinking about the dehumanizing aspect of this, we showed them just the bottom half of the body, or below the neck. And then we did another one where we showed them just the faces, but you couldn't tell which amount of clothing they had. And for the faces, you get nothing. Right? So it's clear that the attention is selective to additively to these women in particular. I'm about to tell you. Okay, so yeah, so we're getting to that. So there it is, the MPFC again. For those of you who've been kibitzing on the methodological battles that have been going on in the neuroimaging literature, there are different ways of picking the area that you look at. For obvious reasons, you wouldn't want to pick the area and then correlate it with other things, because that would be circular, in effect. So in this particular case, the strategy we used was to take the even trials to identify the area of MPFC, and then the odd trials to test our hypothesis. I have another study where we did it a different way. But anyway, so basically what you find is the correlation of hostile sexism with activating the MPFC to scantily clad women is negative 0.52. That is, the more hostile sexist they are, the less they activate the MPFC to the women in the bikinis. But scantily clad men, the more hostile sexist they are, the more they activate the MPFC. So they're thinking, how does he get those abs? Does he work out every day or only 6 days a week? I don't know. These are only men, yes.
Are they only heterosexual men?
We don't know. No, I think we actually did. Orientation, yes, we took that out. That's just the scatter plot. We have other data from this that shows that they're denying agency to the women agency and competence to the women in the bikinis. Okay, I need to finish because I know people have places to go. Yeah, okay, so, quick, okay. All right, so I just want to say one thing about the high part of the space and I've been talking about dehumanization, so what does it mean to humanize somebody? What it means to humanize somebody, besides activating the MPFC, is to think hard about them, right? And so not to leave you discouraged after you leave here, we think that what makes people humanize other people is that they need them. They're on the same team, they're on the same side, and they think that they have competences that, we can work together, right? So it's a combination of interdependence, positive cooperation, and an expectation of competence, right? At least minimal competence. So what we did, Dan Ames and I, was set up a elaborate experiment in the scanner where Princeton students met people who they thought were Rutgers students to work together on creating children's educational games, and they could win up to $50. And we did give somebody $50 for the best joint product. The Rutgers student was actually a Confederate. There were two of them in every experimental session. And one of them said that she thought she could do a good job at this. The other one said she didn't think she would do a good job at it. And then fully crossed with that within Confederate, they read teaching evaluations that were positive and negative. So some of the information fit the competence expectation and some of it didn't. And then we had them form an impression of the person in the scanner where we showed them the teaching evaluations and the photograph of the person they just met, all mixed up together like in real life, where you get bits and pieces of information. So we predicted, swear to God, we predicted this, that you would get NPFC activation selectively in the interdependent case to the unexpected information, because that's the most informative, and you need to know that to work with this person. I had what they call now behavioral data from the 80s and 90s that showed this for attention and thinking out loud and making sense of other people. So here's the punchline. So, and this is an MPFC area that was picked after the fact and a separate task with the same people, impressions versus memorizing. So in the default case, when your outcomes are independent, the MPFC activates the stuff that you expect, more stuff you don't expect, because you don't care about that person. So you're not thinking hard about the information that doesn't matter to you because you don't need this person. But it completely reverses when you have to be on a team with this person, you have to, work with these things that you weren't expecting in terms of competences and incompetences. So we're really happy about these data. All right. Thank you for your attention. This is what I said. I'm not going to repeat it. And my lab thanks you